Thanks everyone for, as Andrew said, for finding the room, and thanks also to the organizers of this great event, including for choosing to include me in the event. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited to pitch these ideas in this really interesting interdisciplinary context that you've created. So that's exciting. All right, so I take it that attention to causes, or mechanism, I want to sort of suggest that we mean the same thing, roughly, when we use those two different words, is common in evolutionary biology, as well as, I think, many other fields in science. Lots of the research involves search for causes, search for mechanism, right, as you sometimes hear, evaluation of the significance of different causes, attention to how different causes interact with one another, et cetera. There's regularly debate about which causes are important, right? This relates a little bit to Karen Kavaka's discussion of frequency debates. And so here I'm illustrating this just with one famous explicit discussion of causal processes in biology, namely by Marr, an example of an exploration of some types of causal action, and then the header for this very conference website, right, with its reference to mechanism. So this focus on causes is my starting point today. What I want to do is first motivate the idea that scientists aim to identify not just causes, but what I call causal patterns, which, again, Karen Kavaka mentioned briefly in her talk earlier today. And then I want to explore what I take to be two implications of this. First of all, I think that this view predicts the persistence of multiple accounts of the same phenomena. So that is, as I tried to provocatively put it here, a lack of synthesis. Accounts may seem incompatible, I think, but turn out to capture different causal patterns, even in the same phenomena. I also think that this framing changes how we should think about theory development, including the development of evolutionary theory. Theory change can be motivated in, I think, two different ways. First of all, by the discovery that a causal pattern simply fails to obtain, right? You thought that some causal action worked in a certain way, turned in some range of phenomena, it turns out it didn't. Or I think probably much more commonly by a shift in research priorities toward a focus on different causal patterns. All right, so getting started down that path. What I first want to do, as I said, is motivate the idea that scientists aim to identify not just causes, right? Not just the mechanism responsible for something, but really what I call causal patterns. And here's a starting point for that idea. I take it we live in a complicated place, right? Our world is complex. In particular, there's what I like to call causal complexity. Phenomena, the phenomena that scientists study, without fail, result from a wide range of causal influences, many of which interact with one another. So here's my favorite way to illustrate this point. Consider any event, right? So often I do this with an audience of philosophers by talking about a match lighting, right? Get as seemingly simple as you can. I figured given the audience, I'd get a little bit biological instead. So let's talk about the scarlet ibis's coloration. This particular ibis pictured here. And there's a reason I think it's to focus on a particular event or occurrence versus a general sort of phenomena. And that is anyway, sorry, I'm getting too philosophical too quickly. At any rate, this particular ibis. So there's nothing special about this event. As I said, literally any event, any occurrence that you wanted to choose could work. So I think the most interesting thing to do is for us all to collectively work through likely causes, right, and the range of different things you can say about this ibis. For the purposes of time, I've sacrificed here, and I'll just gesture in the direction of at least some of the different kinds of causes that are out there, all of which are familiar to the people in this room. First of all, there's something to say here about developmental processes, right? There's something to say here about environmental influence. We're talking about the coloration of this scarlet ibis again. There's something to say about the behaviors of the ibis, how its behavioral traits lead to, for example, access to the necessary carotenoids. There's something to say about its metabolic traits, right, that are needed. Something to say about genetic, extragenetic influence potential in this trait, as well as presumably at some stage, something to say about the role of selection. And if we had, again, I'll say, if we had more time, the next step then would be to start to puzzle out neglected kinds of causes, because that's sort of an incomplete, quick list and sort of gesturing in the directions you might look to find causal influence here. as well as, I think then, a further step, the causes of the things that we've listed as causes, right? So the general point being here that in biological systems and every other kind of system in our world, I think, there are innumerable causes, processes stretching arbitrarily back in time. And these causes interact, right? There's causal feedback and other complex relationships among them, just all over the place. This is what I want to call causal complexity. And I think current scientific practices and methods reflect an awareness of causal complexity. You see the influence on that in all sorts of interesting science being done. So one quick example, a figure from a 2011 paper challenging Mars' proximate ultimate distinction. Some of the authors involved in this paper are involved in this conference as well. And this figure from that paper emphasizes how development can't be relegated to the merely proximate, right, sort of axed off in that way, but rather feeds into evolutionary processes as well. So the main thing I want this picture for is just so that you see all of the different arrows going all of the different directions, right? Even this, of course, is only a really select, limited part of the total influences on organism traits, or we could say on evolutionary processes. But it does show how these causal arrows, so to speak, proliferate, go in circles, and how causal factors thus influence one another, as well as simply just adding up to be quite many. All right. So we're in this causally complex world. Meanwhile, some cognitive scientists have looked into what people describe as explanatory, right? So now we're shifting what we're looking at. What do we, as humans, find to be enlightening? They found, first of all, that we do value causal information, right? Information about what things brought about the phenomenon that we seek to understand. And this fits perfectly with what I've said so far, right? For the hunt for causes, the attempts to uncover mechanisms. But cognitive psychologists have also found that we value general patterns. So rules of thumb that make it so that we can predict what will happen in other relevantly similar circumstances. Interestingly, for my purposes, we value, it turns out, or it seems, general patterns even at the cost of some accuracy. So we tend to err on the side of overgeneralizing, focusing in on patterns and ignoring some exceptions to those patterns, right, to the end of being able to identify these broad similarities in action. So as one might hope, this also mirrors some popular philosophical ideas that have been developed about scientific explanation over the years, over the decades. One important strand in that literature focusing on the importance of identifying causes to generating scientific explanations. And another strand, I think, focusing on how the identification of laws, general laws or patterns in the world is explanatorily important. So here's my conjecture, then, that leads to this causal patterns idea. Scientists are not simply aiming to provide causal information, but to characterize causal patterns, or how the influence of focal causes tends to play out in a phenomenon, in particular in what will be a complex phenomenon, right, in this causally complex world of ours. So why is this? As I said, I think we live in a causally complex world where causes proliferate and interact in all sorts of interesting ways that are hard to get a handle on. And then we have cognitive limitations. We're limited beings, and sort of what we can attend to, the causes that we can attend to in any given moment are limited. But that's not quite the right way to put it, I think. And the reason it's not is it's a sort of limitation sort of claim that we are cognitively limited beings. There's something positive, I think, that should be said there. Something like, right, saying the same thing in the reverse, perhaps, that simple patterns have cognitive value for us. We live in this complicated, in particular, I should say, simple patterns are useful for our understanding of the world. If the cognitive scientists that I mentioned and philosophers, philosophical traditions that I mentioned are onto anything. And simple patterns are useful for our control of the world, right? Figuring out which levers you can pull in order to get what sort of results that you're interested in accomplishing. So we live in this complicated mess of a world, I think, with lots of causes that combine in unexpected, infinitely variable ways. And our ability to understand and shape our world is furthered by the identification of simple patterns, right? There aren't simple patterns out there. We have to do some amount of using selective attention to identify things that look like simple patterns, to isolate bits out of this causal complexity. So what we do, I think, is focus in on the factors that we're most interested in some given research project, and we try to ignore the other factors. So doing this often requires artificially simplifying the parts of the story that we aren't interested in order to improve our access to the parts of the story that we are interested in. So my recent book focuses on this, and in particular, with an eye towards how this simplification is accomplished, which is, I think, an important use of idealizing assumptions in science, simplifying assumptions by which you can bracket some of this causal complexity that isn't immediately relevant to your research interests. Today, I want to focus in particular on the role of our interests in deciding which causal pattern is focal. So if I'm right that scientists generally aim to uncover and make use of causal patterns, this changes the expectation for when a cause needs to be taken into account. So remember all of the influences that I at least lazily gestured at in the scarlet ibis coloration. If the aim were simply to characterize the causes, right, the causes of this trait, this would motivate an exhaustive story of the highly specific combination of influences that happen to bear on this phenomenon. But this isn't, I think, what generally happens, what you generally see in research into similar phenomena in biology. Rather, a biologist comes to her investigation of some organism with specific interests. She's interested in the evolution of carotenoid metabolism and selective transport in birds, or whether and in what ways sexual selection may be responsible for carotenoid coloration, or how parasite load influences carotenoid metabolism and selective transport, or, right, the list goes on. You can imagine lots of different interests that could occasion this focus. So I would characterize this as a question of which causal pattern the biologist is interested in. Causal patterns may be general, like carotenoid metabolism in birds, or it may be nuanced. A causal pattern may be nuanced, like how several of these causal factors combine for the scarlet ibis in particular. So notice that if the aim is to characterize a causal pattern, the first question is not, what are the causes? But instead, which causes? Which causes are we interested in? Which ones will we focus in on? And then start to try to make sense of those bits, those patterns in this complex system. So what this does is introduce or make particularly salient the significance of research priorities, how research priorities shape what causal information is relevant. If I'm right that causal patterns are the aim, then given these research interests, adding more causal information is beyond sort of identifying the causal pattern that's focal. Adding additional causal information beyond that is not only unnecessary, it's actually contraindicated, right? It messes up what you're trying to do, to throw in extra causal information. You're sort of detracting from the causal pattern that you're focused in, what causal features of the scenario you care about. All right, so this emphasis on causal patterns predicts, I think, the persistence of multiple accounts of the same phenomena. Accounts that may seem incompatible, but that instead actually capture different causal patterns, all of which are bound up in this phenomenon that you might study in different research contexts. So as I mentioned before, for maximal drama in a venue that's at least somewhat related to advocacy for an extended evolutionary synthesis, I decided to choose the word synthesis here. I phrase this here as a lack of synthesis, but as will become clear as I go through this idea, what I mean is, in particular, a lack of integration of scientific explanations, particular sort of synthesis that I'm suggesting we don't achieve or don't aim for. So evolutionary biology is naturally construed as a search for causal patterns, I think I've suggested. Classically, at least, right, at least these patterns include around the causal role of common descent on organism traits, causal role of natural selection on organism traits, right, projects that I think uncontroversially have often been pursued separately. And at least more recently also, right, pursuit of knowledge of causal patterns includes the role of development as a cause of evolution, selection as a cause of possibly other forms of evolution, like evolution of groups, macroevolutionary patterns and how these may vary from microevolutionary patterns, non-genetic entities playing causal roles in inheritance, et cetera. I take it the list goes on. So what I'm here encouraging you to do is sort of identify these different research projects and projects that could and often do involve attention to some of the very same phenomena as the pursuit of knowledge of different causal patterns, right? Or what you could equivalently, I think, call knowledge of the causal role of specific select causes within complex systems. But, as I've suggested, because of causal complexity, there are many of these patterns in any given phenomenon. So consider all the things that I suggested there are to say about the scarlet ibis, coloration of the scarlet ibis, and how those relate to the research topics indicated here. So this predicts that it's common to have multiple different accounts of a single phenomenon, right? If you have a focus on different kinds of causal patterns, you'll identify those distinct causal patterns even in the very same phenomena. And each of these accounts depicts a causal pattern that is focal for some research aim. So it may seem like all of these causal patterns simply add up to a complete account of the phenomenon. But I don't think they can be simply integrated in this way. Each account is, as I've at least briefly suggested here, only partly accurate of the phenomenon, right? It captures the part of the story that's of interest, given the specific research program at hand. And in order to accomplish that, this account, right, occasioned by particular research interests, and so focused in on one causal pattern among many, this account misrepresents other parts of the story. So it says just enough about those parts of the story, often incorporates simplifying assumptions to sort of stand in for other parts of other causally important elements of the system. All of that in order to accommodate this limited research focus. So I think this lack of integration is also principled. It's not just sort of, shrug, too bad, we're limited in this way because of the need to simplify parts of the story because of this complexity. Rather, I think there are important advantages to providing these separate accounts. So for example, a sort of very mundane consideration, but a real one, right? This makes available certain mathematical modeling techniques that you wouldn't have access to if you tried to incorporate more of the features of the system. And especially importantly for epistemic considerations, this is because of our sort of cognitive need for simple patterns, for the identification of simple patterns to make sense of this soup that we live in. There's an important contribution to human understanding of these simple patterns, right, that you would lose if you tried to aggregate into a single integrated account. So here's how I think this plays out in at least one evolutionary biology example. Consider research on phenotypic plasticity and its evolutionary role as a speedy form of environmental responsiveness, and thus at least one initial source of novel traits. In my view, this doesn't need to replace an account of the role of natural selection in bringing about some trait, right? Even for the same trait. But instead, this stands alongside it as a different causal pattern that could be investigated for some phenotypic trait. Indeed, actually, I think this isn't quite the whole story yet, right? So I have sort of gestured towards one way in which research priorities can structure an investigation into some trait. But there's at least one other very closely related causal pattern that could be investigated as well here. And that is the question of whether this plasticity might have played a role in the evolution of the trait, right? So there's a separate question, right, that sort of roughly corresponds to corresponds to asking at once about selection, or at least evolutionary processes, and plasticity, namely how those might combine, and if plasticity might play a role in this case. So zooming out again, I think that this view in general, this idea that because of our focus on causal patterns and that conditioning scientific investigation of any given phenomenon, and how that leads to this principled lack of synthesis among our accounts, This predicts, I think, a proliferation of accounts of any given phenomenon, at least any phenomenon that's of interest in the context of different research programs. And I think that, again, because of causal complexity, that's really common. It's really common for researchers with different focuses to find interest in, see as useful the very same phenomena. Because of this, I think it sometimes happens that scientists take themselves to disagree. This is sort of a side point that I couldn't resist making along the way. I think it sometimes happens that scientists take themselves to disagree when they are actually after different things, right? They're talking about the same phenomena out there in the world, and they're saying different, seemingly incompatible things about that phenomenon. So there's a tendency to debate who's right. But it might actually be right that they've said incompatible things about some phenomenon to the end of getting a hold of two different causal patterns. So I motivated this idea in a paper in Bioscience a few years back. And in particular, talked about how differences in theoretical commitments across the field of biology, I suspect, may arise more often from differences in research aims than from actual rifts in theory, right? Sort of real theoretical disagreement. So one may reasonably ask whether this view, going back to the sort of main thread that I've suggested here, that we can expect this lack of integrated accounts of phenomena, or at least can expect that integrated accounts won't take over and render unimportant the prior accounts that focused in on one or another broader causal pattern. So one may ask of that view whether this lets other approaches off the hook, whether this lets different approaches to the same phenomena sort of off the hook too easily, right? Is it too hard to generate genuine disagreement if we accept my view? If I say, well, you know, the more the merrier, everyone can say different things about this phenomenon, that's cool. So I don't think it does. Rather, I think that this sort of a take on where we should expect the multiplication of accounts of a particular phenomena and how those relate to one another, I think that this actually sharpens our sense for what motivates actually jettisoning one of those accounts, actually saying, nope, you don't belong at the table anymore. We've moved on from that idea. So that's the last topic that I wanted to talk about today. My final point I had suggested is how I think our theories change, what that pattern or those patterns look like. The ideas I've advocated so far change, I think, how we should think about theory development, including the development of evolutionary theory. So if what I've said is right, the identification of a neglected cause, right? You have an account of some phenomenon, and someone else says, hey, look, you missed this cause. I think that that in itself isn't reason to revise a theory. There's sort of not yet, you haven't thereby shown that some account needs to be revised. I've suggested that scientists do not and should not aim for integrated accounts, right? But rather introduce additional accounts that help us grasp new causal patterns, including patterns in the interaction of multiple causal factors when this is in fact of a research interest. So it's not just the identification of a new cause, I think, that motivates theory change. But I do think that there are two distinct motivations for updating any given scientific theory. First, the discovery of some causal facts that demonstrate to us that an expected causal pattern, right, something that was identified by a current theory, fails to obtain. An account can, I think, still be wrong on this view, right? It's not enough to show that some account of a phenomenon, of some causal pattern embodied in a phenomenon missed some cause. You say, well, that's not my focus here. But if someone points out a cause that the action of that cause undermines the focal, the account of the focal causal factors, then you have a problem, right? There's a suggestion that the causal pattern that is desired actually doesn't obtain. And second, right, so a distinct motivation, I take it, for theory change is a shift in research priorities towards a focus on different causal patterns. A shift in, or expansion, I should say, of research priorities. So notice, I've emphasized this a bit as I've talked through this, but the first of these, right, the sort of ways in which factual error can lead to the need for theory change, is somewhat weaker requirement for theory accuracy than is maybe customary, right? I've suggested just simply the identification of an additional causal factor isn't enough to warrant revision. But this second consideration, I think, expands the grounds for theory revision into what we want our theories to accomplish. So this is another place where I want our attention to be directed not just at what the world is like, but what do we need out of our scientific theories, right? What should they be doing for us? So this is, I think, the second way of sort of focusing on how a shift or expansion of our research priorities can motivate theory change. I think this is a nice way to interpret much of the motivation behind, for one thing, behind calls for an extended synthesis. So now I'll dig just a bit into one example from that literature. So this is taken from Pigliucci and Mueller's introduction to their 2010 collection. They say, one may ask whether any of the general principles of the population dynamical core of the classical theory are compromised by these new views. Well, no. The concepts we bring together in this volume, for the most part, do not concern population dynamics, our understanding of which is improved but not fundamentally altered by the new results. Rather, the majority of the new work concerns problems of evolution that had been sidelined. So I read this at least as sort of motivating this shift based on a renewed focus or increased interest and uptake in different questions, right? Different questions that we can ask about this very same phenomena that had previously been under-investigated. So shortly after this, the same authors outline three restrictions, what they take to be restrictions of the modern synthesis approach to evolution that the extended synthesis view has challenged. So gradualism, externalism, and gene centrism. So I want to suggest that these so-called restrictions should be taken to be, I think, idealizations, right? Simplifying assumptions. As such, they continue to be appropriate to research into certain limited kinds of causal patterns, like the role of selection and the role of genetic inheritance. But on the other hand, these idealizations, these simplifying assumptions, are patently inappropriate, so much so that you don't even need to say it out loud, patently inappropriate and unhelpful for other research into other kinds of causal patterns, when these simplifying assumptions occlude the very stuff that you want, the meaty sort of bits of causal complexity that you want to get a handle on. And so other kinds of causal patterns, like I think much of the research that's on display at this conference. Okay, so this is not to minimize, I think I should say explicitly, the importance of these kinds of theory changes. I think that, in fact, this kind of theory change that's motivated by shift in research interests or sort of self-aware identification of the limitations of existing research frameworks, I think that these are exceedingly important, both for understanding the history of science and how science has progressed, as well as to making sense of contemporary scientific change. Diagnosing the role of different or shifting research priorities in theory change helps clarify how our interests shape the nature of our science, and legitimately so, right, in a sort of not sketchy way. Our research priorities determine which causal patterns we seek to understand, and that sort of gets the whole game running. Yes. Okay, and so to summarize, I've suggested that the widespread scientific focus on causation or on mechanism should be interpreted as an aim to identify not just causal information, right, but causal patterns, or patterns in how some focal cause or causes, right, it could be sort of multiple causes that are of interest in a given instance, how those, that cause or those causes exert their influence. The aim of depicting causal patterns means that our body of research regarding any given phenomenon is not integrated, doesn't form a synthetic whole, but rather gives us a variety of accounts of how that phenomenon embodies causal patterns of interest. And it's worth mentioning along the way, too, a variety of accounts that will never be complete, right? That will always be sort of just what our interests happen to lead us to investigate. And finally, these ideas predict that theories aren't simply updated when a causal factor is found to be neglected, but rather when the neglect is problematic, either by interfering with a causal pattern that is of direct interest, or else by helping to shift our interests to investigate new patterns entirely. All right, thank you.